and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore Podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And this episode is a special episode because it's both the Christmas episode and episode 150, which is one heck of a milestone. So I thought we could celebrate with a Christmas party. And while I've got some creepy, festive ghost stories coming up on this podcast, I thought we'd start by going to the pub for a song and a dance, because you can't have a party without a song and a dance. And so, to begin at the beginning. And I would like to begin by taking you all to the pub, or more specifically, the American folklorist Wirt Sikes is going to take us all to the pub, because what follows are his recollections of visiting a Welsh pub in the late Victorian age. This is a first-hand account of an American visiting a Welsh pub in the Victorian age at the most wonderful time of the year. Now, long-term listeners might remember that last Christmas, to accidentally quote George Michael, but last Christmas on this podcast, we looked at how much Welsh people like to sing and dance at this time of year. But that's not all they got up to at Christmas time. It was a time for gathering around the fire and to tell some spine-chilling ghost stories. It was also a time for folklore, to do things that might bring you good luck, or at least avert bad luck. And the most famous of all Welsh Christmas traditions, at least judging by my social media pages, is the horse-skulled visitor herself, the Mari Lwyd. The good old Mari Lwyd, who would arrive at your doorstep at all hours of night and demand entry to eat your cake and to drink your ale. And if you'd like to know more about the Mari Lwyd, I've recorded a number of episodes in previous years. Please go back and check those out afterwards. Now, back to this episode, and Sikes recalls how he chanced to pass one evening in the Christmas time, a country inn in a little Carmarthenshire village remote from railways. So he chanced to pass one evening in the Christmas time, a country inn in a little Carmarthenshire village remote from railways, which means it was well off the beaten track. And it would have been quite a welcoming sight, I imagine, like a mirage in a desert. There he was, freezing cold, shivering in the dark streets of Carmarthenshire, trying to find somewhere to warm his spirits, to warm his cockles. And there he sees it, an inn on the horizon. Somewhere he can escape the midwinter weather from, the perfect place to spend the night, maybe. So he stepped inside this welcoming-looking Welsh pub on this chilly Christmas night. And what follows is his own description of the heartwarming scene that greeted him as he stepped inside. And he says, some local festivity of the season had taken place during the day, which had drawn into the village an unusual number of farmer folk from the immediate neighbourhood. So there's a lot of farmers there. Even for a Welsh pub of the period, an unusually high number of farmers in there. And after a simple dinner of a chop and a half pint of cwrw da, which regular listeners will know means good beer, cwrw, C-W-R-W, and da, good, D-A. And after this, he tells us, I strolled into what they called the smoke room. I think we can imagine why they called it the smoke room. It was a plain little apartment with high-backed wooden settles, which is like a wooden bench, high-backed wooden benches, so big they were nearly up to the ceiling, which gave an old-fashioned air of comfort to the place. So even in the 19th century, Wirt Sikes had the feeling this pub felt old-fashioned, which would make it incredibly old-fashioned to us nowadays. And he says that 2 or 3 of the farmers were sitting there drinking their beer and smoking their pipes and toasting their trouserless shins before the blazing fire, which is a lovely description. I'm assuming that means they've rolled up their trouser legs. They weren't just wearing shorts in the winter, although I appreciate many people do. But in this case, I think these farmers have simply rolled up their trouser legs and are toasting them next to that roaring fire. And Sikes continues that presently a Welsh harper with his harp entered from outdoors, and it doesn't get any more Welsh than somebody walking into a pub with a harp and seating himself in a corner of the room began to tune his instrument. The room quickly filled up with men and women, and though no drinks but beer and pop were indulged in, save that some of the women drank tea, Bacchus never saw a more genial company, which is a wonderful way of describing the scene. The room filled with men and women, the music was playing, the drink was flowing. They all got a little bit tipsy. It was all very bacchanalian. They had a good time, maybe too good a time. We can assume some of them woke up with sore heads the next day, but hopefully not too sore, because this was Christmas time, and that meant the next morning they'd be going to church. And one way to make sure these jolly Welsh farmers and the festive ladies, and of course the one American who was writing down all the sordid details that took place, one way to ensure that they did get up the next day and didn't miss church was the ringing of the church bells. No matter how much they drank, those clanging church bells would wake them up the next day. And now you might be thinking at this point in the episode, he promised us scary ghost stories at the start, and all this talk about people drinking too much and clanging church bells, yeah, it's all well and good, but where are the ghost stories? Well, ye of little patience, here they come. Because Christmas was a time of telling ghost stories around the fire, and the good people of Carmarthenshire and further afield did speak in hushed tones. Although, thinking about it, whispering like that might not work on a podcast, so just in case you missed it, in hushed tones, but in a dramatic voice, they spoke in hushed tones of an eerie spirit that just might have taken its name from those very church bells. An eerie spirit that might have taken its name from those clanging Christmas bells that ring out and summon the flock from their slumber over Christmas time. And that eerie spirit is the Tolaeth. Tolaeth, Tolaeth, which may or may not be derived from the tolling of the church bell itself. And this Tolaeth is described as a sound heard before death or a funeral. A sound heard before death or funeral. Now, on the last episode of this podcast, and I hate referring to old episodes, don't worry if you didn't hear it, but on the last episode of this podcast, I did speak about the Cahiraeth, a terrifying death omen that screams and groans before death takes place. And the Tolaeth, it would appear, works in a similar way. It is a death omen. It's a death omen, a warning that a death is going to take place, and it makes its presence known by sound. It is sound that tells you somebody nearby will not be on this earth much longer. And unlike the Cahiraeth, which is very much loud and in your face, it screams at you. You can't miss the Cahiraeth. There's no subtlety about the Cahiraeth. The Tolaeth, on the other hand, borders on the mundane at times, and it's described as manifesting itself as strange noises such as knockings, rappings, footsteps, or of carriages, etc., which, with the exception of maybe carriages, sound like your typical low-level ghostly activity. Footsteps, tap-ins, knock-ins, these are sounds that we would commonly associate with haunting. But the Tolaeth is a death omen that warns us of a death using sound, but unlike the Cahiraeth, in a much, much more subtle way. And while it is unconnected, it does remind me of the kind of phenomena reported in a spiritualist seance. For example, you'll sit around the table, hear these tap-ins, hear these knock-ins, you might even hear footsteps. But in this case, it's related to a death omen and isn't happening on demand. Nobody is saying tap once for yes and two for no or anything like that. You could just be sitting there, passed out after eating too much at Christmas. But then from out of nowhere you hear these sounds that Sikes describes, this tapping, knocking, footsteps or carriages, etc. And I think of all of those, maybe the most unexpected one is the sound of carriages, at least for us, a modern audience. Anyway, we don't hear so many carriages, I mean, unless you live near a stables or something. But I think for many of us, the sound of a carriage going past might be a sign something isn't right. And with this being the festive episode, if you are lying in bed late at night on December the 24th, Christmas Eve, or very early the next day, and you hear rappings or knockings, strange noises, or the sounds of footsteps, then maybe Santa Claus, or Sean Corran, as we call him here in Wales, maybe Santa Claus has popped down your chimney with a bag full of goodies, or maybe, on the other hand, it's the Tolaeth, letting you know that death is nigh. And I know which one I'd prefer. Maybe it's 50-50. Look, just wake up and check your stocking afterwards. If there's stuff in there, you're in luck. If it's empty, you might want to start worrying. However, this is the Christmas episode, so let's keep everything jolly and light-hearted. There's no point scaring people to death, at least not quite yet. So, let's move on to a description of the Tolaeth before we get to some actual stories concerning them, the kind of stories that might be told around the fire in that pub in Carmarthenshire. And this superstition, we are told, of the Tolaeth is common in all parts of the country at the present day. And our folklorist tells us that they have met and heard of many carpenters who always know when they are to have an order for a coffin, as they hear strange knockings in the workshop resembling the noise of knockings made by a carpenter when engaged in coffin making, which is a great, if incredibly creepy way of making sure you've always got stock in store. If you make coffins for a living and they start knocking, well, you know there's an order on the way. And in the particular case of an old lady who lived at Pontshan in Llandyssil, when she was a young woman, she and two other young women were on one occasion sitting near the fire all night watching and nursing a sick old woman of 80 years of age. And at about 4 o'clock in the morning, to their great surprise, they heard the door open and the sound of someone or something entering the house and going about the room, but nothing was visible, nor did the door open as a matter of fact. So, to try and make some sense of this, there they are, looking after this old lady, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, they can hear doors opening, they can hear somebody snooping around the room, and yet they can see nothing. The door is shut, there's no body there. And they weren't the only people to hear this sound, because the aged patient, as she is described, the elderly lady they are looking after, also hears something moving around. And I don't know if she was expecting a visit from Father Christmas, but if we are to assume that what follows shortly after is connected, this is a much more unwelcome visitor, because at 4 o'clock the next morning, the aged patient was dead. The old woman had died. So, was this the Tolaeth in action? Well, the folklorist certainly seems to suggest so, and says that the same woman also claimed that before the death of a prominent esquire in Carmarthenshire, she heard the sound of a carriage See, that wasn't just some random thing thrown in earlier. This woman does claim to have heard the sound of a carriage before the front entrance of the mansion when no carriage was near. So again, we're hearing these sounds, but there is nothing to correspond with them. Doors are opening, and yet no doors are opening. Carriages are arriving, and yet no carriages are arriving. And the idea of carriages in particular, of some kind of invisible carriage signalling a death, is a popular theme in ghost stories. It does crop up again and again. The most famous example I can think of is Cardiff Castle, where some supernatural carriage is said to clatter into the courtyard to signal a death in the family in times gone by. So, beware the sound of unexpected carriages. Now, according to a Sir Edward W.P. Price, Sir Edward W.P. Price, we've had an Esquire, we've just had the Lords in Cardiff, we are getting all the fancy titles on this episode. But Sir Edward was told that people had heard the sounds of carriages before the death of his grandfather, who died in 1855 and was a member of Parliament for Cardigan. And if that wasn't enough, another ancient family from the same county, Nantios, who, incidentally, without going off on too much of a tangent, connect Richard Wagner and his final opera with Wales, but that really is a story for another day. No Richard Wagner tangents on the Christmas episode. But this ancient family also has, or had, I should say, not only a phantom coach, but, and I should warn you, that the sentence you're about to hear is one of the most frustrating throwaway lines ever recorded in an old work of folklore. But we are told not only did this ancient family have a phantom coach that warned them of death, but they even had a protector, a guardian figure. But whether this guardian figure was the Welsh banshee, a woman under enchantment, or a fairy, is not known, full stop. And if you are anything like me, you want to know a little bit more about this potential Welsh banshee / fairy type figure, but sadly, we're going to have to leave it there. So let's not waste any more time on it and get back to the Tolaeth. Let's get things back on track, or back to the tolling specifically, because we are told that before a death in certain families, the church bell would be rung by invisible supernatural entities. So much like the carriages and the other sounds we've spoken about, the tolling of the bell works in a similar way. Now, we are nearing the end of the Christmas episode. I've got one more heartwarming tale of a death omen to share with you. And what I'd like to do is to wrap everything together nicely, like some planned work of conceptual art, like a big Christmas present with a bow on top, to draw all of these seemingly random strands that you've heard on this episode together. So, to set the scene, if you are able to, I would like you to close your eyes right now. Obviously, don't do that if you're driving a car or a forklift truck, or playing tennis or Mario Kart or anything that involves using your eyes. But if you are able to, close your eyes and just imagine that it's Christmas Eve. It's a chilly Christmas Eve, and you are walking through the frosty streets of Carmarthenshire. And there, in the distance, is a haven, a warm, welcoming, inviting Welsh pub. You go inside, sit yourself down in the smoking room on a nice, sturdy wooden bench, some cwrw da lined up in front of you, a farmer wearing shorts to your left, a young lady getting tipsy on tea to your right, a harpist in the corner next to a roaring open fire who stops playing that melodic music, and the room is cast into a hushed silence so we can all gather round and listen carefully to a chilling ghost story called The Tolling of Blaenporth Church Bell. The Tolling of Blaenporth Church Bell, which sounds like the title of an unused M.R. James story. Maybe a story that M.R. James wrote that was so scary he dared not publish it. And it was said, we are told, by several persons living in the parish of Blaenporth, South Carmarthenshire, as things were, that in former times it was a fact that a death in certain families in that parish was always foretold by the church bell in the steeple tolling 3 times at the hour of midnight, unrung by human hands. So, at midnight, this church bell would ring out, but there were no human hands doing the ringing. And one old woman claimed to know the origin of this tolling, and she says, once upon a time, always a great way to start a story, once upon a time, a spirit came at midnight and knocked at the door of a farmhouse known as Tarn yr Eglwys, which is close to Blaenporth Church. "Who is there?" inquired the farmer from his bed, to which the voice replied, "Mair Wen," which means White Mary. Mair Wen of Blaenporth. And what did Mair Wen want in the middle of the night? Well, she continued, "The silver communion cup has been stolen from the church. The silver communion cup has been stolen from the church." And then she begged the farmer to get up from bed and proceed at once on a journey to the town of Cardigan, as the man who had committed such a sacrilegious act was resting that night on a sofa in a certain public house in that town with the silver cup under his waistcoat. So the farmer did indeed listen to this spirit. He listened to Mair Wen, White Mary, got out of bed at midnight, who cares if it's Christmas time, and went to Cardigan. Went to Cardigan where that lowlife was hanging out, or seemingly lowlife. And when he arrived at the public house, named by the spirit, sadly not named by the folklorist, and entered a certain room, a strange man who was lying on the sofa got up, and the stolen cup from under his waistcoat fell to the floor. Can you believe it? Now, the farmer took it up in an instant. He snatched that silver cup and returned with all speed to Blaenporth. It sounds like a great old Hollywood chase heist movie. He's gone in, he's nicked the cup back, legging it back to Blaenporth, and placed the sacred vessel in the church once more. So he had succeeded in his mission. The job was done, and by the looks of it, there was a reward on the way, because we are told that for his kindness and trouble in thus restoring the sacred cup, the good spirit or guardian angel of Blaenporth Church told the farmer that the bell would toll 3 times before his death and before the death of his descendants till the 9th generation. So he would know, he would be warned, as would the next 9 generations of his family, before death came calling. When the end was nigh, he would know in advance, which is a rare example of a death omen story with a happy ending of sorts. I mean, you know, people are still going to die, which isn't great, but at least the death omen is being done in a slightly positive way. I mean, granted, there are some people who might think this is terrible. The last thing they need is a bell telling them they've got a few hours left to live. You'd better make the most of it, act quickly. But look, I'm trying to put a positive spin on this because it's the Christmas episode. I don't want to end on a downer, so we're going to end on a high. It's a good thing. So 3 cheers to that heroic farmer, 3 cheers to the death omens that led him to that villain in Cardigan, and 3 cheers to the church bells heralding the arrival of Christmas Day. All of which brings me to the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore Podcast. But not just any old episode, episode 150. Can you believe it? 150 episodes of this rubbish, and I'm not done yet. And when I look back at the early episodes, I am amazed I made it to 15 episodes, never mind 150. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the only reason I keep doing this is because so many of you amazing people tune in to each and every episode. I have no idea why, but long may it continue. There are thousands of people listening to this, and it blows my brain. Also, all of the nice social media messages, the coffees that people buy me, the people I meet online and in person. There are people from North America, from across Europe, and all over the world who visit Wales and pop and say hello, and it's incredible. So thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on the future right now, because on the next episode, I'll be talking about my plans for the new year, for the podcast and the books and events and things I've got coming up, all this crazy stuff. There's an incredible documentary we've been working on that I really can't wait to share with you. So I hope I can, we should have wrapped up filming by the time the next episode comes out. So I hope I can reveal some more about that. Oh, and if you want even more festive folklore from me, before I forget, I was recently on the BBC. I recorded a special thing about festive folklore and Christmas ghosts and things in Wales. That is available for 30 days after broadcast on BBC Sounds. So it went out on BBC Radio Wales on December the 15th. So it'll be available for 30 days after that. And one of the really cool things is that they went digging into the archives and they found this really cool old clip of the Mary Lloyd from the 1950s, which was the first time I heard it was when I was on air recorded talking about it, it was a nice surprise for me and hopefully a nice surprise for you as well. If you want to find that, it's on BBC Sounds, but if you go to my website or my social media pages, I've shared the link for it, so it should be easy enough to track down, hopefully. And if you're a new listener, there are, of course, years and years worth of other Christmas specials out that you can go back and listen to. I mentioned the Mary Lloyd episode. I mentioned last year's episode all about song and dance in a similar situation. And when I was planning this episode, I was thinking, it's 150. Should I do something special? But then I realized we're only months away from the 5-year anniversary of this podcast, which is even crazier. So I thought, let's hold off with the fanfare for now and make a big fuss in the new year instead. But yes, 150 episodes, 5 years. Where does the time go? I have no idea. But what I do know is that it's Christmas time and you shouldn't be listening to me waffling on. You should be having fun with friends and family if that's your thing, or just your pet, just you and your cat if you prefer. However it is you celebrate this time of year, do that. Don't waste your time listening to me. So it just leaves me to say thank you for listening to this episode, to every episode this year, to every episode for the last 5 years. If you've listened to all 150, you deserve a medal. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And if you haven't finished your Christmas shopping yet, it would be remiss of me not to mention that I do have several fantastic books that are available from all good bookshops, offline and on, and so I've heard they make fantastic Christmas presents. Just putting that out there. And talking about Christmas presents, if you'd like to get me a Christmas present, and why wouldn't you? Well, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which helps keep this thing going, or if you'd like to get me a present that doesn't cost anything, which I know are the best presents, you can leave a nice review for this podcast, give it 5 stars or a thumbs up, whatever the options are on whatever platform you are listening to this on. It all helps and it's all very much appreciated. And remember, however you spend Christmas this year, whether it's just you and the cat or a house full of cousins, whether it's the happiest time of the year or a period you dread the most, there is nothing that can't be improved with a good old M.R. James ghost story. And before you know it, the church bells will soon be ringing in the new year. Although whether it's a human ringing those bells is another matter. Until next time, until next year, Nos da, Nadolig Llawen, and God bless us, everyone.